The world doesn't always reveal greatness in the clothes you expect. Sometimes the person who seems invisible, unnoticed in the background, is the one holding a key that could change everything. On a bright morning in Dubai, the city shimmered with luxury. Glass towers piercing the clouds and streets lined with cars worth more than some people's homes. And among that opulence sat an Arab woman named Layla Al-Fad, a name whispered with both respect and fear in the world of business. She was young, ambitious, and coldly brilliant, a self-made CEO whose empire stretched across continents. But power often hides its own blind spots. Layla believed she could read people. She believed success gave her a sense for character. Until one ordinary morning, she met a man who would test that belief completely. A driver named Kwame Okoro, whose quiet eyes carried the weight of 1,000 untold stories. When she first saw him standing beside her sleek black Rolls-Royce, she barely looked twice. He was new, recommended by a private agency. Tall, reserved, impeccably polite, but in Layla's mind, still just a driver. She didn't know that under the calm surface of that man stood someone who had once studied at a top African university, fluent in more languages than most diplomats. Someone who'd once dreamed of working for the UN before life twisted his path. That morning, the tension in the air was invisible but real. Layla's company, FOD Global Ventures, was hours away from closing a $100 million deal with a European conglomerate, one that could define her legacy forever. Every minute mattered. Every impression counted. Kwame opened the door for her with quiet dignity. Layla gave a faint nod, but her mind was elsewhere, calculating numbers, rehearsing negotiations, scrolling through projections on her tablet. The camera of life zoomed in on two souls from different worlds, sharing one car, one destination, and a storm neither could predict. As the Rolls glided through Sheikh Zayed Road, Layla's phone buzzed constantly. Messages from her board, her assistant, her lawyers. Kwame focused on the road, silent, steady. Yet, even in that silence, he noticed her impatience. The way she sighed at red lights, the way she drummed her nails when traffic slowed. He also noticed something else. A phone call in French, one in German, another in Mandarin, all from her business partners. Layla switched between them fluently, but one call in particular made her frown. The French executive on the other end spoke too fast. Layla struggled slightly, missing nuances, misinterpreting tones. Kwame listened quietly from the driver's seat, understanding every word. But he said nothing. After all, he was just the driver. The moment she hung up, she muttered under her breath, frustrated. That's when a subtle turn of fate began. The first small spark in a story that would soon catch fire. As they reached the company's glass headquarters, the morning sun reflected like a spotlight across the marble floor. Employees greeted her with forced smiles and nervous nods. Layla walked like a queen through her empire. Behind her, Kwame followed at a distance, waiting patiently for instructions. He didn't belong in those hallways of privilege and wealth, or so everyone assumed. But there was something unspoken in his eyes, something that would soon make everyone rethink what belonging meant. Later that afternoon, Layla prepared for her biggest negotiation of the year. The European partners had flown in to finalize the $100 million contract. The boardroom was immaculate. Fresh orchids, chilled water, a skyline view of the Burj Khalifa. Everything screamed control and confidence, except for one thing. Language. The deal involved 3 countries, 3 different sets of translators, and cultural nuances that could make or break the agreement. Layla had hired the best interpreters in Dubai, but nothing could prepare her for what was coming. Minutes before the meeting, one of her interpreters called. Emergency. Couldn't make it. A sudden illness, they said. Layla clenched her jaw. The timing couldn't be worse. She would have to rely on partial translation and her own limited French to navigate the European side. Meanwhile, outside, Kwame stood by the car, waiting. He could hear the commotion from the open doors of the lobby, the hurried footsteps, the rushed phone calls. And then, through the glass, he saw something familiar. A group of European businessmen speaking in French and German, looking lost, irritated. He understood every word, still he stayed where he was. He knew the unspoken rule: drivers don't interfere. Inside the boardroom, Layla welcomed the guests with confidence masking tension. The first few exchanges went smoothly: pleasantries, handshakes, smiles that didn't reach the eyes. But as soon as negotiations began, the tone shifted. Miscommunication crept in like fog. Figures got misheard. Legal terms twisted slightly. And what was supposed to be a simple clarification started turning into confusion, and then disagreement. By the 20-minute mark, the mood had changed completely. The European chairman's polite expression hardened. His translator whispered something that made him frown. Layla tried to fix it, but every word seemed to dig a deeper hole. The $100 million deal, the one she'd worked on for over a year, was slipping away, one mistranslated sentence at a time. Back in the hallway, Kwame shifted uneasily. He could sense the tension through the glass, voices rising, expressions tightening. He could also sense something deeper: arrogance meeting consequence. He took a deep breath. Something told him this moment was more than a coincidence. It was a test, not of wealth, not of power, but of courage. And the man who had spent years being overlooked was about to be seen for the very first time. Inside the towering boardroom, the polished glass walls began to feel like mirrors, reflecting the pressure closing in on Layla Al-Fad. What should have been a triumphant signing had turned into a slow-motion unraveling. Her voice stayed calm, but the tremor beneath it grew sharper with every mistranslated phrase. Numbers shifted. Intentions blurred. $100 million hung on the edge of semantics. For the first time in her career, Layla felt language turning against her. She could control markets, but not meaning. Every glance between the European delegates tightened the invisible rope around her confidence. She tried to compensate with more authority, leaning forward, gesturing firmly, but the energy in the room had already changed. Respect had begun to tilt toward doubt. Downstairs, Kwame waited by the elevator, still in his driver's uniform, the air conditioning humming softly above him. He didn't belong in that meeting, and yet he couldn't walk away. He could hear fragments of conversation echoing faintly through the glass atrium. His mind translated every line effortlessly. He could almost feel where the conversation was breaking, where tone twisted intent. A security guard passed by, nodding at him politely. Kwame forced a smile, but his heartbeat was quick. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence was safer than truth. Still, something inside him refused to stay still. Upstairs, Layla's chief financial officer whispered urgently in her ear. They were losing the room. The European chairman's patience had thinned to ice. If the misunderstanding wasn't fixed, the contract would collapse within minutes. Layla excused herself briefly, stepping into the hallway to catch her breath. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through her phone, trying to reach another interpreter. Anyone. No answer. Then, a quiet voice behind her. "Ma'am, forgive me," Kwame said carefully, "but may I speak with you for a moment?" His tone was respectful, uncertain. He knew what crossing boundaries could cost. Layla turned, startled. "What is it?" she asked sharply, masking panic with irritation. "I couldn't help hearing some of the discussion," he said. "I speak their languages. If you allow me, I can clarify what they meant." For a heartbeat, time froze. Layla's instinct was to dismiss him. How could her driver understand multi-million-dollar negotiations? But the urgency in his eyes wasn't presumptuous. It was precise. Behind him, the elevator chimed. She had seconds to decide. Inside her, pride and survival wrestled. Finally, she whispered, "Fine. Just help me not to lose this." Kwame followed her back into the boardroom quietly, his presence drawing puzzled looks from the delegates. He bowed slightly and introduced himself in flawless French. The room stilled. Then, seamlessly, he switched to German, greeting the other half of the team. Even the translators paused mid-sentence. The rhythm of the meeting shifted instantly. The fog began to lift. Layla sat down, astonished. Kwame listened carefully as each executive spoke, then translated their intent. Not just the words, but the subtle meanings beneath them. When the Europeans used idioms that had sounded confrontational, he softened them with cultural precision. When Layla's statements risked sounding defensive, he reshaped them to express collaboration. The effect was electric. Tension drained from the table. The delegates leaned forward again, curious instead of cautious. Numbers aligned. Smiles returned. In less than 15 minutes, the meeting transformed from crisis to progress. Layla kept stealing glances at him. Who was this man? Every sentence he spoke revealed another layer of knowledge she couldn't place. He didn't just know words, he understood context, business, law, human nature. As he interpreted, he sometimes shifted between languages mid-sentence, French to Italian, German to Arabic, even sprinkling phrases of Mandarin when a technical term arose. Each transition was seamless, like music. The board members began whispering among themselves, impressed. Someone finally asked, half joking, whether he was a professional linguist. Kwame only smiled humbly. Layla's heart raced, not with anxiety now, but with something she rarely felt. Admiration. It struck her that she'd never even asked this man about his background. To her, he had been a line item, a service. Now, in front of billion-dollar partners, he was rescuing her reputation. Still, inside her chest, guilt began to stir. Memories flashed of mornings she'd ignored his greetings, of how she'd once discussed him in front of others as though he couldn't hear. Every act of dismissal replayed like a quiet accusation. The meeting continued for another hour. By the end, the Europeans stood, smiling broadly. Contracts were reread, signatures exchanged, and champagne quietly ordered. Layla's company had secured the full $100 million deal, and the credit, though unspoken, belonged to the man standing beside the wall. As the guests departed, one of them clasped Kwame's hand and said warmly, "Without you, this wouldn't have happened." Layla's employees watched in stunned silence. For the first time in her career, Layla didn't know what to say. Her board congratulated her. Photographers waited outside. But her eyes kept following the man in the simple uniform who was already turning to leave, blending back into the background as if nothing had happened. That evening, Dubai's skyline blazed with golden sunset light. Layla stood alone in her glass office, replaying every detail. Her pride felt hollow. She realized she'd built an empire on knowing talent, but she hadn't truly seen it. Curiosity gnawed at her. Who was Kwame Okoro, really? She called for her assistant, but then stopped. No, this time she would ask him herself. Down in the parking area, Kwame was cleaning the car, humming softly in Swahili, unaware that the CEO herself was walking toward him. The contrast was striking. The woman whose signature moved millions, and the man whose humility had just saved her from disaster. "Kwame," she said quietly. He straightened instantly, startled. "I owe you an explanation," she continued. "But first, tell me, how did you learn all that?" He hesitated, unsure how much to share. Then, slowly, he told her a story. About a childhood in Lagos, scholarships earned, a degree in linguistics and international relations. About his dream to work for global organizations, and how family tragedy had forced him to stay home, take any job he could, and eventually migrate to Dubai. Driving, he said, paid the bills. Languages fed his soul. Layla listened, wordless. Every sentence from him peeled away another layer of her assumptions. He had lived a life of quiet resilience while she'd lived one of noisy success. And in that moment, the line between them began to dissolve. A silence settled between them, heavy and human. Then, from her phone, a notification, the deal's confirmation, broke the moment. They both looked at the screen. $100 million secured. But for Layla, The victory felt different now. It wasn't about the number anymore. It was about the man who'd reminded her of humility's worth. As they stood beneath the evening lights, a breeze swept across the marble forecourt, carrying the faint sound of traffic and call to prayer from a nearby mosque. Layla knew tomorrow's headlines would praise her leadership, her strategic adaptability, her cross-cultural skill. But the truth, what really saved her company, was standing quietly beside a black Rolls-Royce, ready to drive her home. The conference room felt colder than ever. The silence was thick enough to cut through, and Layla's pulse echoed louder than the ticking clock on the wall. On the screen, the translator the partners had brought in stumbled through a crucial contract clause, and the meaning began twisting in real time. The foreign delegates whispered among themselves, their brows furrowed. Layla felt the air slip out of her chest. A single mistranslation could shatter years of effort. Kwame stood quietly by the glass door, holding her coat. No one noticed his eyes narrowing slightly as the translator continued. He caught the error, a dangerous one. The line being mistranslated wasn't about delivery deadlines. It was about ownership rights. If left unchecked, the deal would hand over control of Layla's company to the foreign investors. A $100 million partnership would become a trap. Layla swallowed, trying to keep her voice calm as she asked the translator to clarify. But the translator fumbled again. The investors leaned back, exchanging subtle, skeptical glances. Her palms turned cold. Sweat gathered near her temples. Everything, her company, her credibility, her father's legacy, all hung by a thread. Then, from the corner of the room, a quiet but confident voice spoke up. "Excuse me, but that's not what they said." The room froze. Heads turned. It was Kwame, the same man she had ignored, dismissed, and barely acknowledged. Now, standing tall, eyes steady, voice unwavering, Layla's assistant frowned, whispering harshly, "Kwame, this isn't your place." But he continued, switching fluently into the foreign delegate's language. His tone was respectful, precise. The delegates' faces shifted from confusion to astonishment. He didn't stop there. Kwame moved seamlessly into another language, clarifying the contract's real intent in the investor's native dialect. The CEO of the opposing company leaned forward, listening intently. Layla's heartbeat stuttered. He wasn't just correcting a translation. He was saving her deal. Gasps filled the room as Kwame translated entire paragraphs flawlessly, alternating between 9 languages as if it were second nature. Every word rebuilt the bridge that had almost collapsed. The investors, once skeptical, now looked impressed. One of them even smiled and said, in their own language, "Now we understand. We trust your team." Layla blinked, realization flooding through her. Her driver, the man she'd barely spoken to beyond giving commands, had just rescued her from losing everything. When the meeting ended, the investors signed. The deal went through. The company was safe, but Layla couldn't move. She stared at Kwame, who was calmly folding the contract papers back into their folder. The same man she'd underestimated was now the reason her empire stood. Her voice cracked as she finally spoke. "Kwame, how did you know all that?" He smiled softly, eyes humble yet proud. "Before coming here, I worked with the UN, Linguistics Division. But life had other plans." The weight of his words hit her harder than she expected. He wasn't just intelligent, he was extraordinary, and she had never looked beyond the surface to see it. Layla exhaled deeply, shame and gratitude twisting inside her. For the first time, she didn't see a driver. She saw a human being, one who carried wisdom, grace, and strength she'd never taken the time to understand. The next morning, the news spread. Arab CEO seals $100 million deal thanks to unexpected hero. Kwame's photo appeared beside hers, both standing outside the company headquarters. The internet buzzed with admiration. But inside Layla's office, she didn't think about headlines. She thought about the silence between people, how prejudice builds walls higher than any building she'd ever owned. That afternoon, she called Kwame in. He entered, polite as always, unsure of what to expect. "Kwame," she began softly, "I owe you more than an apology." He shook his head humbly. "You don't owe me anything, ma'am." But she pressed on. "You deserve recognition, not just for today, but for everything you are." She offered him a new position, head of international communications. Kwame's eyes widened. For a brief moment he couldn't speak. Then he nodded slowly, his voice low but steady. "Thank you, Ms. Layla. I'll do my best." Layla smiled, a real, unguarded smile this time. "Do me a favor," she said. "Drop the M's, call me Layla." Months later, the two stood side by side at a global conference. Layla spoke to the audience about leadership, inclusion, and second chances. But when it was her turn to tell the story of how her company almost collapsed, she didn't take the credit. She turned to Kwame. "He reminded me," she said, "that brilliance has no color, no title, no status. It just needs to be seen." The audience erupted into applause. And in that moment, Layla realized something powerful. The deal wasn't the only thing Kwame had saved. He had saved her humanity. When someone laughs at another person for their background, their accent, or their skin, they're not seeing a lack. They're revealing their own blindness. Layla learned that too late, but not too late to change. Because sometimes the person you look down on is the one holding the light you'll need to find your way. If this story moved you, share it. Your share might open someone else's eyes. Watch our previous video for another powerful story that will change how you see people. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, because every click helps stories like this reach the world.